On February 21st, the Atomic Heart video game was released, which takes place in an alternative USSR. The game was positioned as the first high-budget project of a Russian studio in several years. The developers constantly emphasized the use of well-known elements of Soviet culture. Upon its release, the game received positive reviews, in which it was praised primarily for its aesthetics, style, atmosphere, and music. In this video, we will analyze the project's setting and the image of an alternative Soviet Union created by the game. Before talking about Atomic Heart itself, it's worth touching on the state of the modern video game industry. In a capitalist society, almost everything is done for profit, and game development is a perfect confirmation of this. Game development requires the hired labor of many people with different specialties. The appropriate software and well-established management within the team are required, which are impossible without significant funds. There is a lot of money in the gaming industry. In the United States alone, the video game market was estimated at $97.5 billion, which exceeds the amount of funds in the film industry by more than 3 times. The volume of the Russian video game market before the start of the SMO was estimated at 177 billion rubles, with a forecast of growth to 186 billion by 2025. The desire for a constant stable profit is clearly seen in the example of large franchises. Well-known series of games such as Call of Duty and Battlefield shooters, or FIFA and NBA sports simulators, are released every 2 to 3 years. The budget for each game reaches hundreds of millions of dollars, but at the same time, conceptually these games practically do not differ from their predecessors, which initiated the series and used the same set of key mechanics. The growing conservatism of large franchises led to the formation of a spontaneous request among the gaming audience for a high-level game project that would offer a different gaming experience, different from the standard setting of the Second World War or modern conflicts. Atomic Heart was positioned as a project designed to fill this niche, and the cornerstone of the future success of the game was supposed to be its setting, the Soviet era. It is worth noting here that since games are made in a capitalist society by people brought up on bourgeois ideology, and mainly for the purpose of making a profit, they reproduce the cultural and ideological attitudes of the capitalist era, including anti-communism and anti-Sovietism. The traditional image of the Soviet Union and the countries of socialism and bourgeois society is filled with anti-communist myths and anti-Soviet stereotypes about the USSR. Moreover, in the education and culture of Western countries, they are actually fixed and continue to exist in our time. The gaming industry is no exception, which for decades has been broadcasting the image of the USSR as an evil empire and a totalitarian state, not far removed from Nazi Germany. There are many games in which representatives of the USSR are villains, and the plot is built around the Soviet invasion in the same place, where the Soviet Union is not an antagonist in the plot. Its image is ambiguous, or the USSR is completely exposed as a loser state. Games with even a neutral positive attitude towards the Soviet Union are rare. The constant implantation of anti-Soviet myths, the lack of any clear acquaintance of Western developers with Soviet culture, was expected to cause disappointment among the gaming audience, especially in the countries of the former USSR. This was how the platform for the game was created, which, firstly, would demonstrate a positive attitude towards the Soviet Union, and, secondly, would give a realistic image of Soviet society and its culture. Atomic Heart was positioned as such a project. We don't have any mockery of the Union at all. Just as there's no statement in the spirit, it is good that it fell apart. We admire precisely the cultural and aesthetic heritage that we received. The Atomic Heart in Kukrinsky, in the masters of the Soviet poster, in sculptures like Futuristic, in constructionist architects and easel painters, said Maxim Zatsepin, CEO and the main investor of the game. In a variety of press materials, the developers demonstrated robots, references to Soviet cartoons, famous items from the USSR, and other elements. Gave the impression of a game with an unusual plot, which the Russian-speaking audience had wanted for so long. According to one of the anonymous developers, Zatsepin put beautiful imagery above everything else because that is what will sell the game. Based on official materials, it became clear that a combination of images of Soviet culture An ominous atmosphere would be a key element of the game, frightening soulless robots with the appearance of Soviet toys, heavy industrial aesthetics side by side with slender, almost cosmic forms and architecture, downtrodden and weak-willed employees of the Enterprise, overemphasized sexual bodies of ballerina robots, an episodic figure of a typical grandmother in-game animation in pseudo-Soviet style. All this is intended to create the conception of an alternative retrofuturistic USSR, which does not at all correspond to the words of the General Director about the absence of mockery of the Union. The alternativeness of the Soviet game mode is manifested mainly in the graphics. In the plot, parallels with reality from Western ideas about the Soviet Union are quite clearly drawn. The USSR and Atomic Heart is a state of total corruption and alienation of rulers from ordinary citizens. This can be seen from Molotov's first dialogue with the main antagonist of the game, the supposedly ideological communist scientist Dmitry Sechenov. The academician says that his Collective 2.0 neural network, designed to unite the minds of people into a single whole and make it possible to control robots, is aimed at the benefit of mankind and to prevent a new world war. The scientist claims, "The time of the capitalist exploiters is coming to an end. Soon the working class in the West will throw off the yoke of oppressors." He is contrasted with the image of the bureaucrat Molotov, who is not interested in the threat of the destruction of the launch, but he's only worried about his personal plan to take over the world with the help of robots. The plan ultimately boils down to the fact that the USSR secretly introduces combat functions into its civilian robots and supplies them abroad, particularly to the United States. In the end, Atomic Heart tries to convince the player that the purpose of the communist regime is to take over the world, and helping other nations is just a cover to enslave the masses. However, in reality, the communists never set themselves the goal of taking over the world. Revolutionary processes take place in different countries in different ways, and they cannot be imposed from outside. The real Soviet leadership understood this very well, and inexorably fought against the ultra-left line for a revolutionary war, which rather refers to the ideas of Trotsky, replicated in Western literature in a positive way. Even when the real USSR found itself forced to initiate a military conflict, the goals of the Soviet leadership were purely defensive in nature, as in the case of Finland or Poland. Throughout the entire period of the Cold War, the USSR took a defensive position, guided by the concept of the peaceful coexistence of capitalism and socialism. The international assistance provided by the USSR to many countries in Africa, America, and Asia was intended to lead the peoples out of centuries of backwardness and capitalist oppression, and to direct millions of people along the path of progress in building socialism. The Communist Party, represented in Atomic Heart by government leaders with base ideas of achieving personal domination of the world, is a classic stereotype of communist usurpation of power. The negative image of the party is combined with the significant social inequality of the alternative USSR game and the depravity of the party elites. On the territory of the Enterprise 3826, there's an advanced theater in which performances are given by ballerina robots, promoted as the most recognizable image of Atomic Heart. Getting into it, the protagonist learns that only a select few can get a ticket to local performances. It immediately turns out that under the guise of an advanced theater, there's a brothel for the political elite of the country, supervised by the artistic director of the theater, Lastashkin. The artistic director is aware of the dissatisfaction with this fact among the theater staff and struggles with it in every possible way. And from an audio recording, one learns of the arrest of a gathering of disgruntled theater workers. In Atomic Heart, the party leadership of the country does not care about the ordinary workers. Toward the end of the game, the protagonist learns that the Soviet supply of robots to the United States leads to the displacement of workers from enterprises and an increase in unemployment, which turns into dissatisfaction with American workers. The policy inevitably leads to an increase in poverty among the American population and its disappointment in the ideas of communism, because it is the Soviet robots that cause the unemployment. But the totalitarian CPSU of the game is clearly not worried. Meanwhile, in reality, the image of a workers' government that doesn't really give a damn about the workers was exploited by all the enemies of Soviet power, starting with the counter-revolutionaries. The theme of the struggle for power over people completes the image of the Soviet party leadership in Atomic Heart. From conversations with the artificial intelligence, the protagonist learns that the leadership of the party receive a privileged position in the neural network. The lust for personal power attributed to communists and the Orwellian "some are more equal than others" are also among the favorite propaganda labels for capitalists. The game shows an absurd picture. The alternative USSR is making tremendous progress in the field of science and technology. At the same time, the country is ruled by a group of depraved, unprincipled apparatchiks, striving only for world domination. That is, the building of communism is proceeding not thanks to, but in spite of the Communist Party. This state of affairs is fundamentally contrary to historical facts. Industrialization, collectivization, the victory over fascism, the successes of socialist construction, all the achievements of the USSR are directly related to the ideological and organizational leadership of the Communist Party, the theory of Marxism-Leninism, and were carried out by the hard work of communists among millions of non-party citizens. When opportunism prevailed in the CPSU, and the work of the organs of Soviet democracy became mostly a formality, we saw the opposite picture: careerism, the wretchedness of the party leadership, a rollback to capitalism, and the collapse of socialism. The same is true of Soviet democracy. The activities of various democratic bodies, trade unions, Soviets, and other public institutions involved tens of millions of people in building socialism. This was reflected in many decisions of local authorities on various practical issues of the economy, initiatives to improve the life of the population, and socialist production. Through specially formed requirements to Soviet authorities at various levels, Soviet citizens reported their needs and requirements. At the grassroots level, it was the Soviet citizen who acted as the main initiator of setting and solving economic problems. These facts were simply omitted from the game world because they did not fit into the picture of the contradiction between high technology and the society of the alternative USSR drawn by the developers. The masses of people in the game act as the same scenery as houses, trees, and walls of laboratories. The workers, with the exception of a few select scientist heroes, play no role in the narrative and do not move the plot forward. Despite the approach of society to communism and the unprecedented growth of culture during the conversations of the protagonists with AI, we learn that not only foreigners but also citizens of the USSR have not reached the level of consciousness necessary to launch the Collective 2.0 network. Even among minor characters, we do not meet a single ideological communist. Moreover, most of the characters do not ask any questions in connection with the obviously dangerous and inhuman content of the research being carried out. The topic of trust in the government and its representatives is under an unspoken ban. None of the employees of the theater speaks of the need for any decisive measures to combat the debauchery of the party elite. Everything is limited to a statement of fact and a covert struggle with a bad artistic director. The image of a bad Soviet person is also manifested in his speech. Instead of a high level of culture, we hear constant foul language from minor characters, in particular from the theatrical electrician in love with the robot and his colleagues. The main character also constantly swears and is rude to other people throughout the game. At the beginning, he directly states that he only respects Sechenov, and everyone else still needs to earn his respect. The protagonist blindly believes in the correctness of his actions and in the good intentions of the main villain, almost until the very end of the game. Moreover, Major Nechayev begins to see clearly only thanks to the instructions of the AI, who plays the role of the voice of reason in the plot, exposing the social structure of the USSR and the characters. This plot element acts as a metaphor for all Soviet people. Allegedly, without outside help, they are not able to think critically. Despite the unprecedented growth of culture and technological progress, under the guise of a Soviet person, we are presented with an uncultured, weak-willed, and cowardly layman who does not care what happens in his country. Throughout the game, we are never shown how the workers of the Soviet Union participate in the construction of socialism. Such a description of the Soviet people is not true. The development of the USSR took place with the active participation of ordinary workers. It was they who pursued the policy of collectivization, industrialization, fought for the preservation of socialism during the Great Patriotic War, and restored the country after it. In addition, throughout Soviet history, especially until the early 1960s, the vices among governing bodies were exposed and punished. Suffice it to recall what a wide response and participation the party struggle of the late 1920s and the political processes of the 1930s evoked among the population. Even at the decline of socialism, when the mood of lack of ideas and apathy spread throughout the USSR, they did not begin to dominate among all Soviet citizens. As before, the workers offered many ideas on how to improve production and life. They continued to show labor heroism at socialist construction sites. It is enough to recall the history of the construction of the Baikal-Amur main line. In an attempt to discredit the real image of the Soviet people, the authors of Atomic Heart showed their own attitude towards working people as mere extras, who do not affect the events taking place in the world in any way. The history of the Collective 2.0 project is central to the Atomic Heart narrative. From the stories of the scientists who worked on the project, the protagonist learns his true purpose. The project will allow the one who possesses the Alpha Connector to control the will of robots and people. Sechenov, who owns it, hid this truth even from the government of the USSR and devoted only a few close associates to his plan. In the image of Sechenov, the authors of the video game embodied their vision of a communist. The antagonist is formally ideological, but in reality an ambitious person. For the sake of progress, he is ready to sacrifice everything and go to any, even the most inhumane measures. It is noteworthy that even the organizer of the incident, the scientist Petrov, as it turns out from the recording of his dialogue, does not see anything wrong with this. The further plot of the game reveals to the player the true plans of the leaders of the country, Sechenov and the AI, who turns out to be a former colleague of Sechenov. All of them are alien to the ideas of mutual assistance, collectivism, and solidarity, integral elements to the Soviet patriotism of a real person. Each side seeks to remove rivals and use robots to enslave the world for their own purposes. It turns out that Sechenov controlled the main character through an implant and brainwashing, and the AI used the protagonist at the necessary moments to eliminate the leaders of the USSR and other scientists. The game has two endings, and neither of them are good. In the first, Major Nechayev gets rid of the AI, but allows Sechenov to continue to put his plan into action. In the second, the AI kills Sechenov and neutralizes the protagonist in order to carry out his plan to destroy humanity by turning it into a new form of life. Ultimately, the game presents Major Nechayev as a sick man, a blind slave to the system, and a fool who is used by all sides in the internecine struggle. The plot reflects the ideas of the authors of Atomic Heart about the ideas of communism. In order to realize their plans, the communists are allegedly ready to subordinate all of humanity to their will. However, what they do turns against themselves. They pose a threat to all of humanity and die themselves. So the developers are trying to convince the public of the danger of the ideas of communist development and the inevitability of their collapse. However, with the detailed examination of the vivid images and storyline of Atomic Heart, all attempts by the creators of the game to expose communism turn out to be untenable. Real communists, unlike game ones, do not oppose themselves to the people. Moreover, it is the people who put forward the communists as the spokesman of their class interests. The communists know that the methods of achieving their goals must correspond to the tasks set. In the game, like the works of the Cold War, the communists always resort to the most extreme methods. The idea of the mortal danger that the communists allegedly put humanity in front of completely distorts the real picture. Not communism, but capitalism, as a socio-economic system, incapable of resolving the contradictions created by it, puts people before the threat of death. Growing economic crises lead to the impoverishment of billions of ordinary people. Growing environmental problems and the inability to effectively deal with mass epidemics are taking the lives of millions. The deepening contradictions between the financial monopolies put humanity before the threat of a world war. As a result, the attempt of the authors of Atomic Heart to scare the masses with the horrors of communism looks ridiculous and hypocritical. It is enough for a person to simply look out the window to see the capitalist reality is more terrible than the brightest anti-communist caricatures. This becomes clearer if we compare Atomic Hearts with similar projects. During the development process, Mundfish was clearly inspired by elements of the Fallout and Bioshock universes. The fact of borrowing looks all the more obvious because both universes mentioned are an evil satire, not on communism, but on various eras of capitalism. Fallout is known for its extensive use of American popular culture from the 1940s and 1950s in a post-nuclear world. However, it is not limited to these elements. The United States in the world of Fallout is an imperialist state that carries out total surveillance of its citizens, spreads chauvinism, racism, and anti-communist hysteria, arranges war for resources, conducts cruel experiments on people, and covers the omnipotence of large monopolies. After a nuclear war, the remnants of the American government become obsessed with the idea of genocide of the surviving inhabitants and are the main antagonists of the second and third parts of the Fallout series. Unlike fantasies about the Soviet invasion, the mentioned elements of the fictional United States are present in the real US, not only of the Cold War, but also of modern times. The first two parts of the Bioshock series ridicule the ideals of libertarianism. A desperate millionaire decides to build an underwater city where individualism is elevated to the rank of religion, and all its citizens must live according to the capitalist ideal. However, in reality, the inhabitants of the city become drug addicts and are ready to destroy everything around for the sake of a dose of a substance they need. At the same time, the planting of corporate culture, selfishness, and drug addiction, which are depicted in these games, exist in real, not fictional, capitalist society. The third part of Bioshock depicts a fantastic flying city of Columbia, which is a caricature of American capitalist society at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. Skyscrapers and star-striped flags coexist with racism and huge social inequality. The workers suffer under the yoke of capital, and any attempt to organize them is severely suppressed. Against the backdrop of these two relevant universes, Atomic Heart looks less developed. The real inspiration, right down to the plot and timeline, is the lesser-known game You Are Empty, released in the mid-2000s. In it, a certain Soviet scientist, like Sechenov in Atomic Heart, invented a machine to combine all consciousness into one, but after launch it turns people into monsters. The plot of the 2010 game Singularity is also suspiciously similar to Atomic Heart. US Marines, sent to an area of an abandoned laboratory to study a radioactive release, fall into the past, where the reality changes and a power-hungry scientist rises to the head of the USSR and takes over the world. An American soldier is called upon to prevent this and return to the correct world where the USSR was destroyed. Ultimately, the Soviet retrofuturism of Atomic Heart, unlike Fallout and Bioshock, has little to do with actual Soviet culture. The concept of the plot, which looked relevant and topical in the setting of American imperialism or victorious libertarianism, transferred to the USSR, turned into banal anti-Soviet propaganda. But why did it happen that despite loud statements and expectations of the public, the most primitive stereotypes about the USSR ended up in the game? The answer lies in a pragmatic calculation. Putting the setting at the forefront, the developers sought to make a game that would appeal to the widest possible audience. This could be done only by inserting into it specific elements familiar to certain groups of buyers. We have already talked about the Russian-speaking audience above, but it was not a priority target, because a player from a CIS country does not like to buy expensive games and is familiar with torrents. The Western audience, on the other hand, has heard little about Nu Pogodi and Soviet toys, but they were brought up on the horrors of the Soviet Union. In the mind of an ordinary Western player, everybody knows that there was a totalitarian government in the USSR. Many books have been written about this. Supposedly objective bourgeois historians talk about it. For the Western audience, which has been told about the horrors of totalitarian communist regimes since childhood, there is nothing suspicious in this. For them, an objective view of the USSR is precisely anti-Soviet cliches. The entire incident around which the plot revolves is an homage to the Chernobyl disaster, the truth about which was supposedly purposefully and maliciously hidden. Finally, there is a group of specific fans of stereotypes about the USSR and Russia, who like it when the Soviet Union is portrayed as in the Red Alert series of games. For them, the game has a Russian grandmother, Russian women, and red flags fluttering everywhere. An attempt to make a Soviet Bioshock or Fallout is aimed at fans of these universes. Finally, hypersexualized ballerina robots, all sorts of vulgar allusions and obscene words also have their purpose, to attract fans of such content, as well as a very specific group of right-minded gamers and opinion leaders. For these people, the game is presented as a challenge to large franchises and corporations. All these points, put together, serve the goal of maximizing the audience coverage and maximizing profit. Inevitably, there will be comments pointing to the relative progressiveness of Atomic Heart in relation to previous similar games. The developers were counting on this. The Russian-speaking audience rarely receives such projects, and will put up with the ordinary anti-Soviet cliches for the sake of nostalgia and vivid references to the Soviet past. However, don't be fooled by these little things. The game presents the Soviet Union as the capitalists want it to be, a global evil and a red menace. Atomic Heart in no way destroyed this image, but, on the contrary, filled it with other colors. Soon after the release of the game, one eloquent fact surfaced in the VK profile of Artyom Galeev, one of the main developers of the game responsible for the design and the very concept of the project. They found a publication in which socialism was declared the culprit For all the troubles of the inhabitants of Russia, bourgeois ideology dominates in bourgeois society. It pervades the vast majority of the products of the culture of the era of imperialism, filling them with anti-Soviet motives and satire on the communist future, elements of which already existed in the USSR. Life without fear of tomorrow, without exploitation, without wars, and the oppression of capital. Atomic Heart, contrary to the statements of the developers, turned out to be a hodgepodge designed to provide profit for the developer company. The anti-Sovietism embedded in its plot differs only outwardly from other similar products. It is adapted to modern graphics, provides various players with references to what they love, but in general, like other similar projects, it further consolidates the image of the USSR formed by the bourgeoisie as a failed state and an evil empire, an image that one would expect from a product of the bourgeois era. Stay tuned.